The Library of Babel opens with Borges describing his universe to us. He says, the universe, which some people call the library, and he describes a library with this repeating pattern of hexagonal rooms covered totally in bookshelves that sort of continues up and outward in every direction. And the most mysterious thing about this library is that all these books, this infinite, endless tomes, volumes that cover all these shelves, all these books are filled with gibberish, nonsense. You open up any book off the shelf and you see what seems to be a random jumble of characters, of words and letters just on every page. And so that's the setting. That's the context. And of course, what Borges is able to do here is he's able to provoke us to think about our own universe and the mysteries of our own situation. Certainly if you accept the geocentric model of the universe, but even, I would argue, if you accept a heliocentric model of our universe, when we look at our universe afresh, it's also inscrutable and mysterious and strangely organized. The constants of nature that make physics operate the way they operate just seem random to us. When you get to fundamental laws that are irreducible, they can't be explained by anything more basic than just the law is the law. What is that but some text which is totally foreign to us, seems totally random. An example which also seems to be evoked by Borges' infinite nonsense library, which I'm going to come back to at the end when we talk more about the mathematical implications of what Borges is grappling with here, is the question of DNA. You know, there was a time when we were sequencing DNA for the first time, and we just saw these characters, letters, which represent the 4 base pairs of DNA, and they animate all life. They're fundamental to our universe, but they're just seem random to us. Another author who, for me, is able to strike this note of fresh eyes and the mystery, the way the universe is like a kind of cipher that we encounter, is, of course, Cormac Mccarthy. And so this quote comes to mind in that regard. Quote, "Once there were brook trout in the streams, in the mountains. You could see them standing in the amber current where the white edges of their fins wimpled softly in the flow. They smelled of moss in your hand, polished and muscular and torsional. On their backs were vermaculate patterns that were maps of the world in its becoming, maps and mazes of a thing which could not be put back, not be made right again. In the deep glens where they lived, all things were older than man and hummed of mystery." End quote. And so one of the key elements of the story is the way Borges describes the people who inhabit this universe trying to make sense of their universe. All they have is these finite lifespans. They're born in one corridor, and after their lifetime, they die in a corridor not so far from where they were born. And there's these cults and these groups and these religions that sort of pop up and try to come up with explanations and theories, making sense of their reality, which of course is exactly parallel to our own universe and the way in which we develop our own theories and religions and mythologies to make sense of our reality. And they have searches for like a holy grail kind of book, which is like the index of all books in the library. There's ideas that pop up that books that are unintelligible need to be destroyed. And so they go through reopening each book and throwing them down the chute, the infinite chute. Eventually, after going through all these different approaches, Borges gets to his understanding of the library. And his understanding of the library is that the library is infinite. And it's also periodic, which means that the library contains all possible texts. Every book is one book of all the possible books that could possibly exist in the world. And the conclusion of the story is Borges sort of trying to wrestle with the implications of that. This Library of Babel, this infinite library, what are the implications? And some of the implications that Borges touches upon is the fact that every book in this library contains its translation of every other book into every other language, every possible language. I'm grabbing my copy here. See if we can find a good quote. Borges says, sort of summing up, quote, "There is no combination of characters one can make." And then he gives us an example of a bunch of random characters, one after the other. And he says, for example, and we see that example. He continues, "that the divine library has not foreseen, and that in one or more of its secret tongues does not hide a terrible significance. There is no syllable one can speak that is not filled with tenderness and terror, that is not in one of those languages the mighty name of a god. To speak is to commit tautologies. This pointless verbose epistle already exists in one of the 30 volumes of the 5 bookshelves in one of the countless hexagons, as does its refutation." End quote. What I have here is something very amazing. Very amazing. A mathematical theory of communication. I printed it out special for this video and reread it, although I read it the first time, parts of it, of course, and learned about this paper in college. A Mathematical Theory of Communication by Claude E. Shannon. I believe this was first published in the late 1940s, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a foundational text for modern information theory, for modern computer science, and this was written before computers existed. And Shannon is interested in asking a very basic question. What is information? You know, we have an intuitive understanding of information. I might say that I said something with a lot of information, I read a book with a lot of information, or I read a book with no information. He starts on page 2, I don't know if you could see it, with this awesome chart here. Schematic diagram of a general communication system. And so this is where he's starting from first principles. Any communication system, it could be computers talking, human computer, person, in any language. When we get to page 7, we see something really cool, which I want to share with you. Page 7 of this paper. I'm going to hold it up. He starts off, he's dealing with the question of where does language come from? How do we get to language? And the first line here, zero order approximation, symbols independent and equally probable, is a random collection of characters. And of course you get just total randomness, gibberish, something you'd expect to see in one of the books in the Library of Babel. And then he gets the first order approximation, symbols independent but with frequencies of English text. And so what he's trying to do is trying to build up to probabilistic models that account for the structure inherent in English language. And so more gibberish, but the frequencies are correct. They correspond to the frequency of letters in English, which is meaningful English. Second order approximation. He's again using these probabilistic models to build up something more and more comprehensible until you finally get first order word approximation and second order word approximation, which almost reads like real English. And what he's doing is he's saying, what is the mathematical structure of language? Where do we get language from? And this has huge implications for questions of compressibility. And as I mentioned earlier, DNA. When we started sequencing DNA and trying to make sense of DNA and understanding how DNA encodes features of physiology, by looking at the compressibility of different sections of DNA, using the mathematical foundations that Shannon laid, we're able to understand and know whether or not a part of the DNA is meaningful from an evolutionary physiological perspective, or whether it's a part of garbage DNA which is just ignored by the proteins when they construct cells and structures in the human body. Moving on to this question of information that Shannon was so interested in. He did something so brilliant and so important in mathematics. He borrowed directly from the concept of entropy in thermodynamics, in classical mechanics. He says, how does entropy work? And all of it starts with this concept known as the ergodic hypothesis. The ergodic hypothesis in thermodynamics, statistical mechanics, says that any configuration of molecules in a system, any configuration of particles in a system is equiprobable, is equally likely. So in my particular room where I'm standing right now and recording a video, there's air molecules in this room, okay? And they're in some particular configuration. Every air molecule is in a particular place and going in a particular direction at a particular speed. Statistical mechanics starts from the idea that this configuration is equally likely to any other possible configuration. This is where entropy derives from. So if I can imagine all the molecules in my room being in just one little corner of my room, that's also possible. It's equally likely to my current configuration. And these are called microstates. And entropy is a measurement of the quantity of microstates that correspond to a macrostate. Shannon did exactly the same thing for information. And he said, instead of entropy, I want to know how much information is in a book, how much information is in a piece of text. And the answer to that question is, we start with all possible configurations of that text. We start with the Library of Babel. We start with imagining every single book that could possibly be written in this space, in this book, all the possible configurations of letters. And I ask the question, how many books in that space would convey what I'm trying to say, would serve my communicative purpose, would be sufficient for communicating to you what I'm trying to communicate? If that number is very, very high, meaning if there are many books that would suffice, then my information content of that book is low. But if there are very few books that would suffice, the information content of that book is very high.